You are listening to Radio Free Signs of the Times, broadcasting into the heart of an occupied America.
Welcome to this week's Signs of the Times podcast. I'm Henry.
I'm Joe.
I'm Scott.
And this week we welcome back Laura Knight-Jadczyk.
Welcome, Laura.
Hi, I'm here.
Well, there are a couple of things we'd like to talk about this week.
Before we go on, I'd like to just make a comment about something I said in a previous podcast that was quoted back at me. I said something along the lines of, if you don't smoke, start. And I'd just like to modify that by saying that, not everybody should smoke. Some people shouldn't smoke, but some people should. So I didn't want anybody to feel obliged by what I was saying to start smoking. That's just the record.
Thank you for that, Joe.
I was concerned. Some people were asking me whether they should start smoking.
Well, we get those kinds of questions all the time, and indeed some people should smoke and some people shouldn't.
Yeah. It's just my previous statement was kind of a blanket statement that everybody should start smoking.
Well, obviously that's
But it
not
was
the
said
case.
in jest.
Yeah, but, it's hard to tell.
It's really interesting that you can almost gauge the freeness or the freedom of a society by the lack of anti-smoking legislation in that particular grouping.
Well, yeah, my point, what I should have said was, as I said already, some people should smoke, some shouldn't, but everybody should try. If you don't smoke, try and smoke. If you don't like it, then don't smoke. If you like it, smoke. But the point is, people don't get that opportunity to try smoking. People who have never smoked, nowadays, they're never going to start because there's so much anti-smoking propaganda out there. They're never going to start. So the point is, everybody should have the freedom to try, and if they don't like it, don't do it.
Yep. Not only that, but they should have the freedom to breathe clean air. And the fact is that cigarette smoke has very little to do with the pollution of the atmosphere and the industrial waste and depleted uranium and the other evil things that the industrial military complex put into our breathing space is what's really causing cancer and making people sick.
We should do a podcast on this subject.
Why don't we?
So listeners, tune in soon.
We'll cover this one thoroughly. We'll bring you the latest research. We'll give you some real stories, experiences of real
facts
people.
and data you can quote back to your anti-smoking fascist friends.
Exactly. All right, so what are we going to talk about tonight?
So as I was saying before Joe's clarification, this week the Pentagon has finally released 2 very short video sequences that they claim show the Boeing 757 crashing into the Pentagon. We want to discuss that a bit. And we'll also be talking about the Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code has opened the Cannes Film Festival this week. The film version was very poorly received. We want to set the record straight on the Da Vinci Code as well.
Well, the interesting thing about the Da Vinci Code and the Cannes Film Festival and the release of the so-called Pentagon video is that it just so happened that this very timely release from the wonderful fascist government in the United States came about exactly one day before the Cannes Film Festival opened. And it just so happens that our Pentagon Strike video is entered into the Cannes Film Festival, not into a competition, but it will be shown at the film festival. And we find this to be extremely interesting in light of the various other events that have happened in relation to this little video. Because certainly it was in response to the Pentagon flash, which has now been seen by over 500 million people, that the big movement to debunk conspiracy theories began in the U.S. Now, up until that point in time, debunkery consisted mainly of just vague dismissal of conspiracy theories without any specific designation of any particular conspiracy or any particular conspiracy theorist. So, as soon as the Pentagon strike flash came out, within, when did we publish it? Does anybody remember?
It was the end of August.
Yeah.
End of August. So
2004.
Right. So it was on September 11th, wasn't it, that AboveTopSecret.com came out with their
evidence that a Boeing 757 hit the Pentagon.
Evidence that a Boeing 757 did hit the Pentagon, which was completely debunked in Joe's Flying Fish article, as we refer to it. And just shortly after that, the Washington Post contacted us for an interview. We did an interview, and of course they referred to us directly as conspiracy-minded individuals or conspiracy theorists. So we had essentially baited the bear out of his lair. And there was direct mainstream media attack on this video, which is something that no other conspiracy theory or any other group has managed to accomplish thus far, to bait them out. So this tells us one very important thing, that this is something that they really don't want us to go there. So not only did they launch a full frontal attack, they also began using the famous counterintelligence maneuver of suggesting that anybody who considers that a Boeing 757 did not hit the Pentagon is just falling into a, quote, honey trap, unquote. A honey trap being, of course, a situation where you buy into a certain line of thinking and then it is totally debunked later on, and then you're made to look like a fool. Well, if anybody really thinks that any of the 9/11 truth-seeking / researching is going to go anywhere at all with their pressure on the controlled demolition ideas, or that Flight 93 was shot down over Pennsylvania, etc., forget it. It's not going to go anywhere. The only thing that ever will really go anywhere is pressure on the Pentagon issue, because the Pentagon is the weakest link in the chain. Absolutely. And we have proven it once again by the fact that they have come out with a full frontal assault on this particular idea. They don't worry enough about any of the other ideas to think that they even need to come out and rebut or attack it. But this one really gets them going. This one really makes them nervous.
Yeah, well, I think it was because of the exposure that the Pentagon strike flash video got that they were forced to come out, because they realized that one of their worst nightmares had come true, and that was that the ordinary person in the street, and large numbers of them, as we said, 500 million plus, were getting access to information that hadn't come to them via the mainstream press. And that's really dangerous for them, and that's why they had to come out and control it, get it, or pitch it within a major mainstream tabloid or newspaper like the Washington Post. They had to deal with it. Everything else, as you say, is completely ignored by the mainstream press. That's how they do it.
Well, that's because the situation surrounding the Pentagon is so obvious to the mind that wants to think logically. You can talk all day long about controlled demolitions, and there will always be an equal number of experts to say that, well, under this and that circumstance or whatever, the building could have fallen exactly that way, even though there's the famous Silverstein quote that he said, well, let's pull it, referring to building number 7. But nevertheless, they can trot out all their experts and they can rebut anything that is said. However, if they are obliged by, outrageous demand from the American public to submit the Pentagon situation to a truly fair and open and independent investigation, there's nothing that they can say, because there is no evidence that a 757 struck the Pentagon. There is plenty of evidence that something else did, and I'm not talking necessarily a missile here either.
One of the emails that we get most often from readers about the Pentagon strike and our views on the Pentagon attack is, if no Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, then where did Flight 77 go, and what happened to the people on it? For me, this is what kind of sets the Pentagon apart from the World Trade Center, part of 9/11, in that it's almost like people subconsciously have this awareness that there's something very disturbing about the Pentagon. And it's not, I suppose it's not even subconscious, but this is what, the impression I get is that this is what disturbs people to ask this question, because they know that if it can be proven that... they have to face the fact that their government really
did away with some of
Yeah,
their
there's
own
something an awful lot
citizens.
more insidious about it. You know,
Yeah.
it's
Because when
the people died in the World Trade Center. They died when the planes hit the building. And
but you saw that the planes, hit the building, and that's what caused them to die.
So it's almost like there's closure on the deaths of those people because people were able to see how they died.
Right.
But by saying that Flight 77 didn't hit the Pentagon, there's no closure on what happened to those people.
And then you have
scary.
to face that very, very unpleasant question: what did happen to Flight 77? Where did it really land? And what happened to the people that were on it? And did all of them die? Or just some of them? So all of the interesting details and ideas about what did happen to Flight 77 and who was behind it are in our book, 9/11: The Ultimate Truth, which can be obtained from qfgpublishing.com. And we think we have some pretty good ideas that come very close to solving the great mystery of the Pentagon, which is the weak link, and it's obviously the weak link because this is the one thing that the powers that be have a real sore toe about. Whenever you get close to this one, for some reason, they feel like they have to do something to divert it, to attack it, to reject it, and there is no other conspiracy theory that scares them as badly as this one. I mean, they never even came out on the JFK assassination with any kind of direct attack on conspiracy theorists. I mean, even after Oliver Stone's movie, they didn't have to. I mean, they could ignore those things, ignore them, and they would go away because there were infinite numbers of experts who could say anything they wanted, including that a magic bullet did all the crazy things that magic bullet did on that day. Same thing can be said about collapsing buildings. But what it can't be said about is the fact that it is impossible for Boeing 757 to have struck the Pentagon and have done the damage it did, to have not left any wreckage, to have made the size hole it made, to have had such confusion among the witnesses. And keep in mind that the witnesses, many of whom were witnesses who clearly had a vested interest in supporting the government story, and others were those who were in such a state of shock that it was easy to suggest to them anything and have them believe it and remember it as a fact, as any good psychologist will explain is what happens in traumatic situations.
We should also point out that Donald Rumsfeld himself referred to, and I quote, the missile that hit this building in an interview with Parade magazine 1 month after the Pentagon
A little
attacks.
Freudian slip there.
And furthermore, there are 3 other videos that the FBI confiscated very, very shortly after the attack on the Pentagon. One from a service station, one from a hotel, and one from the Virginia Department of Transportation that all had cameras focused on that area, and those videos have never been shown.
Well, I read somewhere, sometime today, somebody wrote me an email, and they were telling me that there were 80-some videos that were listed as being in the government's possession that related to the Pentagon. And someone else had mentioned that Washington is a city that normally has a lot of tourists, and tourists generally have cameras. So one wonders if many of these 80 videos are videos that were confiscated from tourists, if they were immediately out on the street finding anybody with a video or anybody who contacted them said, I have a film, whatever, and that these people's videos were confiscated and they were silenced. Mm-hmm. What is really distressing is to know that, you have this handful of so-called witness testimonies. These witnesses have never been forensically examined that we know about. They have never been, checked for the veracity of their claims by an independent body. They have just basically supported the government line, and it's been let go at that. The whole thing just stinks to high heaven. There was no 757 at the Pentagon. That's the bottom line. But that brings us back to Khan. As I said, it just so happens, in a coincidental manner, that the Pentagon strike video is being shown at the Cannes Film Festival. We have our own little crew of Quantum Future Group members down there schmoozing with the stars in Cannes and taking photographs, preparing a nice photograph album for everybody, for all of our readers to view when they come back, and shaking the hands. Maybe they'll get to, meet and greet some of the big stars, and of course maybe they won't, but at least they'll have a good time. It's a nice town. It's got a beautiful view over the Mediterranean, and we're real pleased to have our little independent filmmaking group down there hanging out with the big boys. And next year...
And the thing is, the Pentagon strike has probably been seen by more spectators than any of the films that have ever been entered into the Cannes Film Festival or ever will be.
That's the truth. And obviously it's been seen by more people than have read the Da Vinci Code. I mean, 500 million is, and it's probably higher because remember that figure that when we did the count, that was 6-8 months ago. It was a long time ago. So it's probably gone up into the, 600-700 million, and people keep passing it around. And believe it or not, some of us and our friends and neighbors and family, get copies of it in their emails, and they send it to us and they say, "Gee, look what we just got." And we say, "Yeah, we know, we did it." So it's been around the world a few times at this point, and it really strikes a chord in the hearts of everybody who sees it, because their logical brains, the part of the brain that analyzes what their eyes see and what they know to be possible and not possible, understands a great truth, that no 757 hit the Pentagon.
And what's fascinating in the news reports of this most recent video release, over and over again you see news reports that say this video shows the Boeing 757 hitting the Pentagon. And of course, if you study the frames, that's not at all what it shows. It shows this white blur that approaches the Pentagon. You see,
it shows absolutely nothing other than what we have already seen, what we have already been exposed to for the past 5 years. I mean, that's absolutely it. There is nothing new, nothing, absolutely. And yet, the mainstream media, with their major headlines and their, the release of this video, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what a maneuver on the day before the Cannes Film Festival when our little gang is down there. I mean, we should feel honored that we are getting such special attention. So anyhow, back to Cannes and the Da Vinci Code. The Da Vinci Code. I hear it's not getting very good reviews. Is that so?
That's what they say. There were even snickers in the showing before the press when it came to the big climactic scene.
Yeah, and there was an article where they said, usually at the Cannes Film Festival, the critics are pretty harsh, and so, but at least at the end of the showing of these various films, there's at least polite applause. And apparently at the end of the first showing of the Da Vinci Code, there was just, jeers and snickers and, whistling and no applause.
Not a surprise. The book was really bad.
Well, in one of the reports I read, they said that at one point, at a serious point, a point that was meant to be serious in the film, but the audience burst out laughing. It was prolonged laughter at a serious point in the film. And I like to think that that's the point when, in the book, when the great secret of the kind of Haros Gamos is revealed.
Oh, my God.
And what it's all about. I like to think that that's...
Oh, yeah, the ritual sex act.
Yeah, I mean, you have a bunch of
We're
guys...
going to get into that.
The point at which the snickering came is when Tom Hanks turns to Audrey Tautou and says, "You are the last surviving descendant of Jesus." And that's apparently when everybody started to snicker.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus. Sorry. No pun intended. There is a reason that people have been excited by the Da Vinci Code, and it's not because the Da Vinci Code so much gives the answer. I mean, in a way, it's kind of like, the Pentagon flash video doesn't give you the answer of what happened to Flight 77, but people can see that there is something there that strikes their logical mind, that part of their mind that has been overtaken by the programming of the mass media and the dumbing down of the global educational systems. And that is that there is something wrong with Christianity. And that Christianity clearly and obviously can't be what people purport it to be. I mean, for example, when you consider the fact that in this day and time, there are classifications in the DSM-4, the Manual of Psychiatric Illnesses, that refer to, anybody who hears a voice or, thinks that they get messages or whatever as being, psychiatrically sick. They need to be treated in some way. However, there is a line in there, I believe there was in the I think the DSM-3 at least. It said that they were excluding religious inspiration from this category. In other words, under any other circumstance, if you hear voices or you think you're getting messages from other beings or whatever, in any context except religious, you are certifiable. You are ready to be locked up and put into a straitjacket, possibly, and medicated. However,
if it's religious, you're presidential material.
Exactly. So there's a little bit of a problem, and here we are in the 21st century, and people still believe they're going to be raptured, that a man who lived 2,000 years ago got crucified and died and rose after 3 days, and then some number of days later ascended to heaven in clouds of glory with angels, etc., and that he is going to return on said clouds, and he is going to open wide his arms, and of course he's going to be wearing the regimental blue and white robes and have the long flowing locks and beard. And they are all going to ascend into the sky, leaving their clothing and whatever behind. I'm sure they'll leave their fillings and their...
Not their wallets.
So in the 21st century, people actually believe that.
Well, the funny thing, just if I can interject here, the funny thing about the whole Cannes Film Festival and the Da Vinci Code being shown there is something I read in a report where there are apparently a lot of religious groups that have descended on Cannes to basically stand in opposition to the Da Vinci Code. They're handing out pictures of the Virgin Mary, etc. And there was one person who was involved in this, religioso Christian, fundamentalist Christian, or Catholic, or devout Catholic, whatever, who was saying basically that who was asked for her opinion on the Da Vinci Code, and she said, it's okay, it's a film and stuff, but the problem is that it's distorting the facts. Right, so obviously you can imagine what facts she had a problem with. Now, it just seemed to me that it was perfect for whoever wanted to completely immerse humanity in nonsensical disinformation and fantasy in a religious context. They've achieved it because they have two groups of people, large numbers of them, arguing with each other, and each of them have these two ridiculous theses, and both of them are claiming that each of them holds the facts of the matter.
Well, the failure of both the Da Vinci Code and Christianity is the idea that both approaches take the biblical story of Jesus as historical fact. And neither of them really understand that it is not a historical fact. And this has been proven in biblical scholarship. There is a wonderful book that was published recently. I wrote a review on it. It's on the website at www.cassiopeia.org. And if you go to the sitemap, you will find a link to an article entitled The Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton Mack. And the thing is that Q is short for the German word Quelle, which means source. Quelle, or the Q source, is considered to have been one of the two sources for Matthew and Luke, the other being Old Mark. But the unknown lost source is called Q. I write in this article that while this subject comes up under the subject heading of Q hypothesis, since the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas, it really isn't a hypothesis anymore. More and more books are indexing Q as the sayings gospel, and the first layer of Q is known as Q1. So, Burton Mack tells us that once upon a time, before there were gospels of the kind familiar to readers of the New Testament, the first followers of Jesus wrote another kind of book. Instead of telling a dramatic story about Jesus' life, their book only contained his teachings. Their focus was not on the person of Jesus or his life. They were engrossed with the social program that was called for by his teachings. Their book was not a gospel of the Christian kind, a narrative of the life of Jesus as the Christ. It was a gospel of Jesus' sayings. The book was lost to history somewhere in the course of the late first century when stories of Jesus' life began to be written and became the more popular form of charter document for the early Christian circles. He goes on to tell us that the mythology that is most familiar to Christians of today developed in groups that formed in northern Syria and Asia Minor. There, Jesus' death was first interpreted as a martyrdom and then embellished as a miraculous event of crucifixion and resurrection. This myth drew on Hellenistic mythologies that told about the destiny of a divine being or a son of God, and these congregations quickly turned into a cult of the resurrected or transformed Jesus, whom they now referred to as the Christ. The congregation of the Christ experienced a striking shift in orientation away from the teachings of Jesus. After this, then, of course, the narrative Gospels began to appear. But the important thing is that what they're saying is these Hellenistic stories were the basis for creating the life of Jesus. If you read Mack carefully, you will come to understand that Jesus probably wasn't Jewish. He probably did not have anything to do with, with a revival of the Jewish religion. He most likely was a Greek or a Hellene in some way, and most likely he was a philosopher of the Cynic variety.
One of the popular ideas about Jesus is that he was an Essene, and of course Mack, with the Q document, shows that this is also an incorrect hypothesis.
Yeah. So if you come to a little understanding about the fact that the Q document, the underlying layers of information within the New Testament itself, can reveal to you a great truth about who this individual was around whom the Jesus legend was wrapped, you can get a broader understanding of exactly what it is the Da Vinci Code is driving at. Because when you read that these stories that were wrapped around Jesus were Hellenistic mythologies, you come, of course, to the dying God mythologies. Now, these myths have been with us for millennia, literally millennia, and they relate in a large part to even older esoteric doctrines that had to do with a type of, well, shall we say, a psychological or a spiritual death and rebirth. And in the oldest esoteric doctrines, the story of the birth of the child from the virgin related more to the birth of the true self from the death of the old man, put off the old man and put on the new man in Christ, as Paul would have written it. And he was talking in esoteric terms. He wasn't talking necessarily about a literal death and resurrection. But getting to the Da Vinci Code, here we have an interesting bit of information. Graham Phillips is an interesting guy. He writes some interesting books. He does some fun research and finds out all kinds of fun things. I just don't necessarily agree with the way he interprets it, because there are certain pieces to the puzzle that he is missing. But in any event, he wrote a little book called The Marian Conspiracy, which is subtitled The Hidden Truth About the Holy Grail, the Real Father of Christ and the Tomb of the Virgin Mary. And in this book, he tells us about his conversation with one of the people who work in the Vatican's secret archives. And he says, Father Rensanelli had written to me a few months earlier following the Italian publication of my book, The Search for the Grail. I had investigated the historicity behind the Grail legend and had arrived at a controversial conclusion. Today, most people think of the Holy Grail as the cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, but I had argued that the term Grail was originally applied to any holy relic that was thought to have been associated with Christ. Well, this is true, except for the fact that the Grail legends predate the Christian mythos and were more or less absorbed into it and became part of it. So without considering that factor, Graham is not going to go anywhere. But he says, There was one such artifact, an ointment jar, which disappeared, then was refound. When the story of the jar's discovery broke in the Italian press in the August of that year, 1995, it ignited immediately a controversy. It began with Rocco Zingaro di Fernando, the Grand Master of a secret society claiming descent from the ancient Crusaders, the Knights Templar, holding a press conference in Rome. Zingaro claimed to possess the True Grail and produced an ornate stone cup as proof. So much did the story of the two Grails dominate the Italian media that it sparked a rumpus within the church itself. The Italian cathedrals at Genoa and Lucca also came forward with their conflicting claims to possess the real Holy Grail, and the squabbling became even international when the Spanish Cathedral of Valencia joined in with its claim to house the sacred relic. So at this point, Graham was considering writing a follow-up book, and he came across a reference to the so-called secret archives of the Vatican, which are supposedly Vatican records to which very few church officials have access. They are said to contain all sorts of ancient documents concerning events in church history that the Vatican kept secret. So he wrote to the Vatican Library asking if they could confirm or deny the existence of the archives and didn't expect to hear back. However, he did get a letter. Father Rincinelli had trained as a historian at Oxford University before he was ordained and had long been fascinated by the Grail legend. So Father Rincinelli wrote to Graham and said he wanted to meet him and even offered to show him the secret archives. So Graham then tells us a little bit of the history of Christianity. Christianity was created essentially by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. It was a peculiar irony that Christianity and its message of peace and goodwill should have been so furthered by a man who history records as a tyrant and a murderer. I think everybody knows the story of Constantine being converted by supposedly a sign in the sky, which has more recently been shown to have probably been a meteorite or an asteroid that crashed down in the Apennines in the mountains. And that it happened right around the time that Constantine was on his march. And this is very likely what he saw. So he didn't see a divine sign from God. What he saw was an asteroid or a meteorite. But in any event, so he converted to Christianity, or claimed to have converted to Christianity, but the real truth was that he needed a religion to control his people. It was a political move. Years after his so-called conversion, Constantine murdered his own son and had his wife boiled alive in her bath. But in any event, Christianity as we know it was created as an act of political expediency. He needed to unite the empire, and since his domineering mother, the Empress Helena, had already embraced Christianity, that was what he picked. So first, before he could use Christianity to unite his empire, he had to unite the Christians, because there were all different kinds of Christians. There were many groups with many practices, with many gospels, and they all had different ideas. There were Gnostics, and there were Ebionites, and there were Diocetists, and there were Monophysites, etc. So in AD 325, Constantine summoned all the Christian leaders to his palace at Nicaea, which is now Turkey, for a council. After weeks of wrangling, Constantine appointed his political ally Eusebius, the head of the church at Caesarea at Palestine, to draft a compromise settlement. What Eusebius came up with were, in essence, the religious dogmas which still remain the central pillars of the established church. Nearly everyone present objected to something, and Constantine lost patience and decreed that anyone who refused to sign the agreement would be banished from the empire. And he enforced his ruling. Those who dissented were never heard from again, and those who conceded became the hierarchy of the universal or Catholic Church. So that's basically how Christianity came to be. Now, the problem is that as Graham continues to talk with his Father Rincinelli, he gets inside the so-called secret archives of the Vatican, and Father Rincinelli tells him the archives were secret once, and that's how they got their name. But in 1883, Pope Leo XIII declared that the papacy had nothing to fear from history and opened the archives to scholars. Yeah, like we're going to believe that? But in any event, there was something that Father Rincinelli read in the secret archives, and what he said to Graham Phillips. Now, Graham Phillips, I understand, did not actually get to sit around in the archives and read stuff, but this remark was made to him by this Father Incinelli, who said to him, "Have you considered a possible link between the Holy Grail and the Holy Mother?" He said, "I found a rather interesting reference concerning the Grail in the archives." And then he goes on to explain that even though the Bible makes no reference to the event of the ascension of Mary, old church tradition holds that the Virgin Mary ascended bodily into heaven. More progressive members of the church consider the story a myth, and that Mary's mortal remains would have been interred according to contemporary custom. The Catholic world remained divided on this issue until very recently, and it was left up to the individual churchgoers to make up their own minds. In 1950, however, the Assumption was declared dogma by Pope Pius XII. From then on, Mary's bodily ascension into heaven became official church doctrine. The new doctrine meant that, unlike other saints, Mary's mortal remains were not to be found anywhere on earth. This left the church with a problem, because just to the east of Jerusalem, in the valley of Jehoshaphat, is a dark underground shrine which for centuries had been regarded as the Virgin's tomb. It was discovered in AD 517 by Severus, the bishop of Antioch, and did contain a number of bones. And I should mention here that Severus got the information that this was Mary's tomb from a dream, so we can't really put too much reliance on that. But in any event, in the 1950s, they sent somebody out to check these relics out, because they were afraid that the shrine would be used by critics of the church to undermine the credibility of the papacy having just declared Mary as having been ascended to heaven. So Giovanni Benedetti, an archaeologist attached to the Vatican, was sent to examine the relics, presumably in the hope of proving them fake. Much to the relief of the Vatican, the relics turned out to be sheep's bones.
Oh, phew.
Gosh, tragedy, huh?
Divine intervention.
Exactly. So when the archaeologist Giovanni Benedetti reported back on his findings, he was summoned to appear before one of the most powerful departments in the Vatican, the Holy Inquisition. Now, although the Holy Inquisition has been renamed the Holy Office since 1908, the High Court of Orthodoxy is still, even today, very much in the business of ferreting out heretics, and something of its sinister reputation still clings to its offices. And I believe Dan Brown refers to the Holy Office in his book. The Inquisition may no longer have the power to burn dissenters at the stake, but it does wield the authority to censor the church writings and to excommunicate any Catholic who it deems to have offended the faith. On pain of excommunication, Benedetti was instructed to discontinue his work and was forbidden to publish or speak publicly about his research. Being a good Catholic, he complied. And here we come back to Father Incinelli, who's talking to Graham Phillips. Father Incinelli had found the minutes of the meeting of Benedetti's appearance before the Holy Office of the Inquisition and had read them. Apparently, one of the things that had been said in this was that Father Incinelli found something in the report which intrigued him. It seems that Benedetti had spoken to someone about his theory because the minutes showed that he had been specifically instructed to clarify a remark that he had made. Father Incinelli took a notebook from his pocket, says Graham Phillips, and read his translation of the relevant reference, which said, "Benedetti's statement that the Holy Mother was the Holy Grail should be properly clarified so that no improper inference should be made, namely that the Grail was merely an artistic representation of the Holy Mother." Now, this is an interesting remark because it seems that they're moving a little bit closer to the truth here, because there is the whole question of the Virgin Mary, the devotion to Mary, the veneration of the Virgin, and the veneration of the Virgin and the Mother is extremely ancient. It predates Christianity. It has become a central theme in the Catholic theology, and to a billion Catholics or so, Mary is the most important woman who ever lived. So, this leads us to another interesting thing. Now, remember that remark, that the Grail was merely an artistic representation of the Holy Mother. Now, Let's get a little bit further in this. The idea of the virgin birth appears to have arisen from a simple mistranslation. Around AD 130, when the Bible was translated into Greek and Latin, mistakes were made. One such mistake had been the word now rendered as virgin. The original text did not employ the Hebrew word for virgin. It used instead the word meaning a young woman. Now, let's look at something that's a little bit more interesting, keeping in mind that these Hellenic or Hellenistic myths that surrounded the story of Jesus came from northern Syria, and that we've got the idea that the Holy Grail is an artistic representation of the Virgin Mother, or the Mother. Now, if you look at some other ideas that exist in that same area of the world, such as ideas that have been carried for millennia, it seems, from most ancient times, and that now exist within Sufism, which is under the aegis of Islam at the present time, but it existed long before Islam. There is the idea that nature is the highest and greatest mother. Nature gives birth to all things, though she herself is never seen. She is the receptivity that allows the existent things to become manifest. And we begin to understand why the idea of the Grail, a receptacle, a cup, a bowl, a platter, from ancient times, predating Christianity, was a representation of nature. And here's what the Sufis, or the Sufi Sheikh Ibn al-Arabi, had to say about nature. Though nature is viewed primarily as receptivity, both activity and receptivity, or the quality of being acted upon, are manifested through it. Nature is receptive to that which instills form into it. The forms that are instilled may be active or receptive, male or female, yang or yin. Sometimes Ibn al-Arabi shifts the point of view from which he considers nature and sees it as an active instead of a receptive principle. So from one other point of view, nature is darkness, since that which acts upon it is either God, through his command, the word, or the spirit, which are light. And yet the Shaykh insists that the nature is at the root is also a kind of light, or else it could not begin to display its properties in the spiritual world between the universal soul and the dust of primal matter. He says that true darkness is the unseen, since it is neither perceived nor does perception take place through it. Thus, nature also, though it may be called darkness in relation to the spirit which infuses it with life, is light in relation to absolute nothingness. So nature is the highest and greatest mother, is a kind of blackness, and we think once again of some items in the Bible, such as the Song of Solomon, where the so-called Hieros Gamos is being acted out, and the female voice says, "I am black but comely, my lord." And we come to understand that these are allegories for a very great spiritual secret. And that's what we're going to talk about, this great spiritual secret that is part of a myth that was created to convey secrets, and it became a history wrapped around a man who may or may not have known this secret and may or may not have activated it in his own life.
We're going to leave it there for this week. As Laura has just mentioned, we're going to continue our discussion next week of this great secret, the true meaning or true origins of Christianity and the true symbols within Christianity and all great religions.
So thank you for joining us. For more information, come to our site, www.signs-of-the-times.org, and we'll see you next week.
You are listening to Radio Free Signs of the Times, broadcasting into the heart of an occupied America.
Welcome to this week's Signs of the Times podcast. I'm Henry.
I'm Scott.
I'm Laura.
And this week we have a guest who's going to be sitting in, the lovely ski bunny Joanne from Colorado.
Hello, everyone.
Good to have you with us, Joanne.
So in our last podcast, we began our discussion of Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code. We started by looking at the fact that there's a message in the book, not necessarily the code that Dan was talking about, but it's a book that raises certain questions about Christianity. And we talked about how this aspect of it bypasses people's logical minds, because people look around them and they see the role of Christianity in the world and other religions in the world, and they see that they don't live up to what they pretend to be, that the world is not better off for 2,000 or more years of these teachings, and so they're posing questions. We then gave a brief overview of the history of Christianity, beginning with a brief look at the Q document, which is the document that scholars say is the source of the teachings of the man who has come to be known as Jesus. We then looked at the formation of Christianity under Constantine and some of the work of Graham Phillips in his book, The Marian Conspiracy, where he began looking at the question of the Grail and some dark secret that is supposedly being held in the secret library of the Vatican. And we finished by looking at, or touching a bit on, the Songs of Solomon and what the real meaning of that would be. And so that's what we'll pick up today.
Thank you, Henry. The important thing that I think we need to consider is the fact that people are becoming more and more aware that the monotheistic religions, Judaism, which gave birth to Christianity and then also inspired Islam, have not moved humanity any closer to finding the solutions to the pressing problems of civilization, of man, his relationship to the earth, his relationship to other men, and his relationship to the cosmos.
And that should be clear to pretty much anybody who looks out on the world today. That shouldn't be a shocking statement.
Yeah, if you got two neurons firing, you can see that we're standing on an abyss getting ready to fall in at any moment, and it's not going to take too much to set off a global holocaust from which humanity may not emerge alive. So these are very, very important questions at this time, and people are very frightened inside themselves. Even the people who try to live in denial are aware, and more people are becoming aware each day and being forced to face the cold, hard facts as the economy tanks and as the effects of the aggressive occupation of Iraq continue, and more people in the United States are having their children come home in boxes. Soon it's going to be so that there won't be a family in the United States that doesn't have a relative or a friend who's come home in a box. And when that happens, I feel rather sorry for George Bush and the neocons, because people are going to wake up. But in any event, we also talked last week about the Pentagon strike and the fact that our Pentagon strike video was being shown at the Cannes Film Festival right at the time that George Bush and the neocons decided to release their amazing footage of what hits Pentagon, the blurry little nose cone, which completely bombed. I think it did more to contribute to people being convinced that there was no Flight 77 at the Pentagon than anything else. But in any event...
Oh, well, Laura, that's just a setup, and they're going to come out with the tape that's got the clear images any day now.
Oh, yeah, well, bring it on, as George Bush would say. But getting back to Dan Brown, it's kind of a cipher, because on the one hand, he wrote this book that really touches a lot of people, and it touches them for reasons quite different from what what you might expect, as you outlined already. So the question is, why and how did this book become so wildly popular? Because, quite frankly, as a lifelong reader of some voluminous capacity, I have to say it's not really a very good book. It has its moments that are, for somebody who wants some entertaining reading. It has moments that are entertaining. But it's so implausible, and most of the dialogue and the activity is really completely cheesy. And for somebody who's familiar with the facts of the hidden history of the world, it's beyond cheesy. It's insulting to your intelligence. For example, we have here Dan Brown's famous tome, and I need to mention that I actually read this book on the train back from Paris. Last year, we took our girls up to Paris to go to the Louvre, and we spent the day there. And I'd heard about the book. Several people had said, "Have you read the Da Vinci Code?" No, I haven't read the Da Vinci Code. And since they had mentioned that it was based on Lincoln Lee and Bajent's Holy Blood, Holy Grail, I wasn't really too interested in reading it because I'd already read all of that material and had pretty much exploded it in some articles, in a series of articles called The Grail Quest that we published on our website back 1999-2000. I did a lot of research on the so-called Priory of Sion and came to the inescapable conclusion that it was just a big fraud. But I'll get into that in a minute, because right now I want to tell you what Dan Brown wrote about the Priory of Sion. And believe me, the information that it was a fraud was available on the internet, and not just from my own articles, because my articles were based on the research of some people who were on site, who went to the archives, who did some digging, did some, first-hand observation and analysis. And there are several very fine books, factual books, written about it, which were available to Dan Brown. But he didn't bother to do his homework. This is what he wrote about.
Or his wife didn't bother to do her
homework. Well, yeah. Anybody who was following the trial, where Lincoln Lee and Bajent were suing Dan Brown for plagiarism, are probably aware that it was pretty well concluded by the judge that he got most of his stuff from his wife, who did read Holy Blood, Holy Grail. So yeah, he did steal some ideas, but that's how fiction goes. People. You can't own these ideas, and it would only be if he lifted the actual text, bodily from their book and used it, and he didn't do that. He wrote a fiction novel based on their research, and it was perfectly legitimate for him to do that. But at the same time, he certainly should have given them a little more credit, and he should have at least been honest about it and admitted where he got it from. But in any event, this is what he says about the Priory of Sion. Right in the beginning of the book, big, bold letters, it says, fact. The Priory of Sion, a European secret society founded in 1099, is a real organization. In 1975, Paris's Bibliothèque Nationale discovered parchments known as les dossiers secrets, identifying numerous members of the Priory of Sion, including Sir Isaac Newton, Botticelli, Victor Hugo, and Leonardo da Vinci. The Vatican prelature, known as Opus Dei, is that Day, Henry?
D.
Opus Dei, is a deeply devout Catholic sect that has been the topic of recent controversy due to reports of brainwashing, coercion, and a dangerous practice known as corporal mortification. Opus Dei has just completed construction of a $47 million national headquarters at 243 Lexington Avenue in New York City. All descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. And that is this whole statement that he prefaces with this big, bold word, fact, is pure horse shit. There's no other word for it. It's horse hockey, people. Because number one, the Priory of Sion is not a European secret society founded in 1099. The Priory of Sion was a fraud perpetrated by a small-time crook in France named of Pierre Plantard, who later added de Saint Clair to his name to give himself airs. As I said, the information on this is posted in great detail in a series of articles called The Grail Quest on our website at www.cassiopeia.org. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this issue about Opus Dei. Now, Opus Dei, I'm not going to say too much about that because I'll let Opus Dei do their own defense. I'm not into defending Catholic organizations since I'm totally against the whole, the Christian fraud anyway. So, but let's say that they probably are a cult. They probably are doing weird stuff. Anybody who gets into, whipping themselves or wearing hair shirts or total celibacy and think it's going to get them to heaven are a little weird in my book. So
it was also founded under Franco in Spain and had very, very close ties to the fascists. So,
yeah, that tells us something too. When he talks about the descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate, like I said. Now, there may be some groups that engage in these so-called secret rituals, like the kinky sex ritual that he describes somewhere around the middle of the book, that the poor heroine Sophie witnesses her grandfather performing with some goddess receptacle. Having a little hard time with terminology here tonight. Sorry. Yes, there are some groups that get into this kind of weird stuff. There are some groups that get into stuff that is so weird that, maybe one of these days we'll do an entire show just on some of this sick crap that goes around and passes as occultism. But basically, as far as the Christian mythos, it has nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing.
But it's got a lot to do with occultism.
Well, it depends on
what occultism is known as today in the...
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned last week, according to the most definitive scholarly research, which has been put together and written about by Burton Mack in two books. One's called Who Wrote the New Testament, and the other one is called The Lost Gospel, the Q Document, and the Origins of Christianity. Mack pretty well establishes that, first of all, whoever the man around whom the Jesus legend was formed was, first of all, he wasn't Jewish. He was probably Greek, or at least, strongly Hellenic in his background. He was a Cynic philosopher, or along the lines of the Cynic philosopher. Interestingly, Mack comments on the fact that there is a strong influence of the so-called idea of the kingdom of God threading its way through the material of the first and earliest layer of the Q document, which he doesn't quite understand. But if you think about it in terms of a group of people who more or less were ready to chuck out the whole religious shtick that they were dealing with at that time from all different points of view, and the whole social thing, and make a social statement and experiment with new ways of being, new ways of relating to each other, and at the same time retain a certain spirituality, because, as you might think, that the Cynic philosophers pretty much tossed out spirituality too. They were very, very realist, rationalist. What existed was what you could see, feel, taste, touch, smell. And they weren't too much inclined to make spiritual speculations. But if you take and you...
They were the Richard Dawkins of the era.
Yeah, they were, blind watchmaker types.
Yeah.
But whoever was behind this material that came to be known as the Q document, they were, in a sense, very realistic and very scientific, and very much involved in observing their reality and experimenting with new ways and new relationships. And at the same time, they had an unusual concept called the kingdom of God, which, as has been quoted, it was within. It was a spiritual condition. So that is a little bit unusual. However, it's not so unusual when you begin to study some of the other spiritual doctrines that have existed continuously for these past 2,000 years or more in certain areas of Eastern Europe, moving into even to Central Asia. For example, the influence that later generated the Cathar beliefs came from that area of the world. They from Bulgaria, from the
Bogomils.
The Bogomils, yes. And there were strong similarities between that and some of the Sufi ideas. And I think I mentioned the Sufi Shaykh Ibn al-Arabi last week. And then we find that in the construction of the layers of Christianity, that the ideas of the crucified, dying, and resurrecting God were added to the mix several layers after the first layer of Q, and have been identified as originating from northern Syria, which is moving in that direction. Now, if you understand the ancient Siberian shamanic practices, you know that the death of the external self and the birth of the spiritual self, the descent to the underworld or the ascent to the heavens via a ladder, on a horse, by a tree, by some sort of divine sickness where you would fall sick for a number of days and then rise from your bed a transformed being. All of those are evident in this myth of Jesus, the dying God who died and was buried for 3 days and resurrected. And all of this type of spiritual initiatic practice is evident in this myth. So the first problem you have is when people like Lincoln Lee and Bajent come along and they assume that there is any part of this myth that is historical, and then begin to try to find customs or actual historical linchpins on which to hang a real history to try to prove that, a man named Jesus exists, that he was a Jew, that he married Mary Magdalene, that they had children, or that she escaped to France or wherever and gave birth to a child who then became the progenitor of the Merovingians. All of this is pure nonsense. And also you have to remember that a lot of what they were writing was based on ideas of that sort that were propagated by a fraud. A complete fraud. And if you don't believe this is a fraud, you really need to do some research.
And we need to go back and we need to say this and repeat it and say it clearly. The entire story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem, being arrested, being scourged, being taken before Pontius Pilate, being taken up the mount, carrying his cross, being crucified, all of that is bogus.
As history.
As history.
However, it is a stark mythical representation of a true initiatic practice. And that initiatic practice can be found in bits and pieces and traces in some of the most ancient teachings that still continue to exist on this planet. And those teachings, that initiatic practice, apparently, from the best we can determine, actually does lead to a heightened state of being, a permanent change in the being, and even, in fact, possibly what we would call superhuman powers. So don't knock that part of it, and don't think that it doesn't have a seriously important significance, but just do not take it for history. And forget the whole thing about Jesus being a Jew, Jesus marrying Mary Magdalene, and having children, etc. And let me just say something about that. When I first read Lincoln Lee and Bajent's book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and they repeated some of their stories about the myths of Mary Magdalene coming to France and bearing the child of Jesus and so on and so forth, and that this was something that was well known in France to the French, I was a little curious about that, because at that time, and still, my husband has a colleague who lives in Marseille and has lived in Marseille nearly all his life. He's a scientist, And he's also very interested in history. He's kind of an interesting scientist, and he's very funny. He actually looks and talks a little bit like Yul Brynner did in his heyday, so he's a lot of fun to talk to. But he's a very serious mathematician. Stop laughing, Henry. It's true.
I know him. I know it's true.
Yeah. I mean, did I peg him? Does he not look like Yul Brynner?
You pegged him.
Yeah, I mean, you just almost expect him to, stand up, shave his head, and say, "Shall we dance?" and do the whole King and I thing. But in any event, Robert was kind enough to answer some of my questions about this, and his information was based on living on site and in the place and having studied these things himself and been interested in them.
We should note that the legends that the authors of the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail talk about have Mary Magdalene showing up in France near Marseille. So
right.
It's right in that area.
Right. But then they completely distort these things because the story actually is, which, the French of that region have told and retold for centuries, that yes, Mary Magdalene showed up in a boat with another Mary, Mary the Egyptian, and St. Maximin. And that she went to an area not too far from Marseille, which is now it's called St. Maximin. And she went to live in a cave, became a recluse or penitent, and lived her life in prayer and penitence, and died there. And supposedly her bones were later found and identified as hers. I seriously doubt. I think they date to the 2nd century. I've been to see it. I took some photographs. I've got some photo albums of these things on our website. But in any event, there is no legend of Mary Magdalene coming to France and having a child, and that child, went on to become the founder of the Merovingian dynasty. And on the subject of the Merovingians, whoa, the Merovingians, the long-haired priest kings. Now, that goes in a whole different direction. They were obviously Frankish, and they had the whole long hair thing, and supposedly they had some sort of power, some ability to touch and heal, and all kinds of other legends rose up about them. But if you actually read, go to the sources and read what Gregory of Tours wrote about these early Merovingians, you come immediately to the idea that these are people you wouldn't invite into your home. Now, the fact is that, at one point in my life, I got heavily into genealogy and discovered that, I myself descend from some of these people through my Percy ancestors and several other branches. And reading about them was quite interesting, but, I realized, who would want to have that blood in their veins? These people were nuts. I mean, they were patricidal, matricidal, fratricidal. Yeah, what's killing your sister? Sistercidal? They were evil people. Who would want to be related to these people? Who would want to bring them back? So, we're getting back to the issue of the initiatic secret that is encoded in Christianity. There is a teaching that has survived for over 2,000 years, and it has been transmitted through the oral traditions of the Eastern Orthodox Church. These are traditions that are known to a number of teachers of some importance in the Eastern European area. Some of them are Russian, Bulgarian, etc. George Gurdjieff was in touch with some part of this tradition and incorporated it into his experimental promulgation of the ideas that are behind this tradition. Boris Muraviev was a little more familiar with the direct tradition, possibly not more familiar, but at least he transmitted the tradition itself from the monks on the island of Athos, and writing his 3-volume compendium entitled Gnosis 1, 2, and 3. Figure that one out. He talks about the fact that the human being has, in his ordinary state, 3 centers: Gurdjieff talks about the centers also in similar terms. And these centers are the thinking, the emotional, and the moving center. I suppose that if somebody was really interested in trying to figure out how they relate to Freudian or Jungian psychology, they could have fun with that, but I don't think it's terribly important. And that there were three higher centers, the higher intellect, the higher emotional, and then what was called, in a sense, the sexual center. And I told you we were going to talk about sex, but I don't think it's going to be quite the way you want to hear it. But the thing is that the higher intellect relates to the thought that gives form to the formlessness of the sexual energy or the creative feminine energy. And the higher thought or the intellect was depicted as light, and this is how it was depicted in the Sufi teachings. And the sexual center or the feminine creative principle was depicted as black. And the action of the light upon the light of thought or the word, the word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word, the light, acts upon matter in a creative way, and matter as the Divine Mother, and I believe I read the passages on that from Ibn al-Arabi last week. The Divine Mother is that which receives the impression and essentially gives birth to the forms that are contained in the idea of the light. Well, applying that to a human being, you have the possibility of uniting the light, the Father, and the Mother, the black magnetic center, in your spiritual makeup and seating this in your physical body, which is essentially what is being asked for when the Lord's Prayer says, thy kingdom come. Remember, the kingdom of God is within. Thy will be done on earth being the sexual center, the black part of the feminine creative center, on earth as it is in heaven, heaven being the higher intellect. So bringing the higher intellect together with the sexual center or the mother and seating it into the physical body was the act or the process or the initiatic sequence that would make a human being into literally a Superman, as much as can be possible in this reality, because of course there are going to be certain limitations by virtue of the circuitry that the human body is capable of carrying, and that depends, of course, upon DNA. So naturally there is a family bloodline, there is a DNA connection that is necessary to be able to accomplish this to any great degree, because if you don't have the DNA potential to carry those higher circuits of energy, you're going to burn yourself out. But in any event, this process is a very precise process. It has been carried as an oral tradition for thousands of years. It is probably the exact tradition that was behind the imagery of the mother being impregnated from heaven, giving birth to the divine child, who then was crucified and after 3 days arose, because this actually describes the process of the initiation, of the coming to be, of the bringing together of the higher intellect and the feminine creative principle of the higher centers, and then marrying them or bringing them into being or into manifestation in your physical body. Now, we get a little more precise about these things in some of the articles on our website, and in my book, The Secret History of the World, I talk about it at some length. And towards the end of the book, I begin to put the things together and give rather explicit details about the process itself. But it's not a process that you can necessarily undertake on your own. It has happened, it can happen. This is what the ancient alchemists were doing when they were transmuting lead into gold. It had nothing to do with transmuting, physical lead into physical gold. It had to do with this process of seating the higher centers with the lower centers into the human body. Part of the process of doing this is the merging of the lower emotional center with the higher emotional center. These two centers merge, and that is the shall we say, the crossroad or the link. You have the lower moving, which is corresponds to the higher sexual center, and then the lower intellect that corresponds to the higher intellect, and then you have the two emotional centers, lower emotional and higher emotional. When the lower emotional and the higher emotional merge, you then end up with a figure 5. You have the two intellectual centers and the sexual and moving center, and then in the center you have the merged emotional centers, which, causes them all to function together. In other words, you live in this world, but you are no longer of it. So this is the secret. The doing of it is a bit more problematical because it's not something that you just decide to do. You can't get it by meditating on it. You can't do it by any of the normal processes that have been promulgated for a very long time as the ways to higher spirituality. If it were possible to do it that way, people would have been doing it a lot, and the world wouldn't be in the condition it's in. So take that one to the bank. So the interesting thing about this is that, as y'all know, back in 1994, I succeeded after a couple of years of experimenting and contacting myself in the future, so to say, the Cassiopeian transmissions, ourselves in the future. And they began to talk about many things that relate specifically to this idea, to these teachings. And they helped us to put together the elements from all the various philosophies and esoteric teachings that were out there. They helped us to look for the clues and to discover these things and to put together a cohesive and coherent narrative of exactly what is going on this planet, what has been going on this planet, what probably is going to happen on this planet, and what we can do about it, if anything, which primarily has to do with going through this process, each of us individually, this being born, working, being crucified, laying dormant for 3 days, 96 hours, however many, then being resurrected. So that's the important message behind Christianity. Christianity, in this sense, esoteric Christianity, has probably existed for many, many thousands of years, 20, 25,000. There's evidence that I present in my book, Secret History of the World, that suggests that this is the practice that was the power behind the megalith builders, the groups of people who erected the blanket of megaliths that extends all over Europe, Eastern Europe, into Russia and in many other places around the planet. So if you're interested in finding out, the truth about these things, and you probably will want to get and read this book that I have put together after, 35 years of research. And the final thing I want to say about it is as I was studying through these things, as I was collecting all of this information and, the issue of Da Vinci, and this is kind of an interesting thing because, like I said, I was reading the Da Vinci Code on the train when we were coming back from our trip to Paris. I had taken it with me, even though I had resisted reading it up to that point. I had taken it with me as a travel read, and on our way home, after we had spent the day in the Louvre, I picked up this book and started reading it. And I thought, well, this is really interesting because, of course, at the time I had no idea that the opening scenes of the book were in the Louvre, right where I had just been. So I found that to be pretty interesting. And when I got home, I began to dig into some of the ideas and began to look at Leonardo da Vinci just a little bit more closely. And that's when I discovered the links between Leonardo da Vinci and Marguerite of Navarre, who was married to a grandson of a very famous Cathar, or great-grandson as the case may be, who also was a patron of Nostradamus, of Rabelais, and several other people that that the great alchemist Fulcanelli mentions in his mysterious book, The Mystery of the Cathedrals. Also, Marguerite was one of the sponsors of the great cathedral in Auch, and I have a photo essay of the cathedral on my website. If you just go to www.cassiopeia.org, click on the sitemap link, and then you look for the photo essays, you'll find the link to the essay about Auch Cathedral. Because in Auch Cathedral, there is actually a series of statues, and based on my research, I believe that Marguerite was very much influenced by Leonardo da Vinci, who spent his last years in France with her brother and with her. And she sponsored the building of this cathedral and the artwork that went into it. I think that Leonardo was very influential in the creation of the art that's in this cathedral. So there's a series of statues. It's called the Burial of Christ. And the Burial of Christ depicts a woman with a crown of thorns standing in a position of honor next to the body of Christ. And to her right is the mother, and at the feet is Mary Magdalene. But it is quite clear from this statue, from this series of figures in this gilded statue, that Mary Magdalene is not the wife of Jesus. If anything, she might have been a daughter, because it's a family scene, and she is in a position that a daughter would assume. There's the mother, there's the alleged wife, which we have to understand is metaphorical, because the wife, remember, is the sexual center, which is black, and she's standing there holding the crown of thorns, which is, the suffering of the initiatic process, which has long been depicted as a dismemberment, boiling in a cauldron. The most ancient representations are the boiling in the cauldrons of regeneration of the ancient Celts. So this woman is there depicting a certain symbolic event, not necessarily an actual wife, but it's quite clear that in the 16th century, when this artwork was being created, that there was an awareness that there was some mysterious thing about the so-called family of Jesus, about the religious depiction of the crucifixion, and someone was trying to encode this in this cathedral in Auch. The next thing I noticed as I continued to ponder the works of Leonardo da Vinci and read everything on Leonardo that I could get my hands on, as well as translations of his own writings. It's unfortunate that so much that he wrote was scattered far and wide and has never been fully reassembled. But there are several volumes that contain his notes and his writings. And what I noticed was, as I was looking at the Last Supper, there's been much made about the peculiar positioning of the hands of the various individuals sitting at the table, especially the hand that bends backward with the knife in it. Some people have tried to say that this is the hand that doesn't belong there, that it doesn't belong to any of the figures there, because it's such an odd gesture and a very awkward way to twist an arm. However, if you look through all of Leonardo's sketches and the studies that he did for this great painting in Milan, you'll find that he actually did a study for this particular arm, and it does survive. So it is quite clearly an arm that does belong to the one who has been identified as the Apostle Peter. I've described all of this in some detail in an article on our website, which is called what did I title it? Fulcanelli and
you changed the title 3 or 4 times.
Oh well, it has Fulcanelli and Da Vinci Code in it. So
it.
Just look for Da Vinci Code on the sitemap page and you'll find it, because I actually show the images and show the studies that Leonardo worked from. So Leonardo was connected to Marguerite of Navarre, who sponsored the building of Auch Cathedral. She was also a sponsor of Nostradamus and Rabelais, who were both mentioned by the alchemist Fulcanelli in his works, The Mystery of the Cathedrals, and also his book, Dwellings of the Philosophers. Fulcanelli was also a close associate of Camille Flammarion, and Flammarion was a very good friend and supporter of Allan Kardec, who was a great researcher into Spiritism. And Henry, do you have some details on Kardec and Flammarion that you have gleaned from some of the French books that are not available in English? Can you tell us a little bit more about him?
In the mid-19th century, in the 1850s, as there was in the United States, there was table tappings, there was an interest in spiritism. Allan Kardec became interested in it in the 1850s and took it upon himself to attempt to organize and publish some of the communications that had been received. And he brought to this critical eye and wouldn't accept just anything that was going on. One of the things that they would use would be sometimes a planchette that was similar to the kinds of devices that Laura was using in the Cassiopeian transmissions. Other times it was automatic writings. But he never took what was said as gospel. He always sat down and did what research he could to confirm or reject, and then he would compile this information. During this period of the 1850s and 1860s in France, there were hundreds of thousands of people involved in this. And Kardec organized networks of these people throughout France. It was very strong in the working class. Kardec himself died in 1869, and as we've seen so often, these kind of movements break up and splinter. But Camille Flammarion, who became a very well-known French astronomer, was very closely involved with this work in the 1860s. And we know that there is a connection between Flammarion and Fulcanelli, or Jules Viol.
Because as Patrick Riviera has written and analyzed and researched quite brilliantly, the true identity of Fulcanelli is indeed Jules Viol, the great French physicist.
And so we see a link between Kardec to Flammarion to Fulcanelli, Jules Viol.
Who then wrote about Rabelais and cathedrals, and actually, as I demonstrate in my article, gave the direct clue to us to lead us to Arches Cathedral, where we can view this astonishing statuary, this assembly of persons that is called the Burial of Christ, not to mention the fabulous 18 windows of Arnaud de Mol. And if you do a little anagram playing with this word Arnaud de Mol, you come up with I am Leonardo. So I've done it in my article. I can't remember the exact words that I came up with, but there are some very strong connections. And then when you circle these unusual hands in Leonardo's great work, The Last Supper, and you draw lines between them, what you have is the most amazing figure, the exact, and I mean exact, depiction of the constellation Cassiopeia. The solution to the Da Vinci Code.
The solution to the Da Vinci Code is Cassiopeia. There you have it, folks. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week. For more information, visit our website, www.signs-of-the-times.org. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.